So last week we finished up, and we're still going to be in the book of John, chapter 7. We saw a failed attempt at the Sadducees to arrest Jesus. That didn't work. And strangely enough, the reason the guards did not seize Jesus was because he was simply teaching the truth with authority, and they just couldn't bring themselves to arrest him. They just knew it wasn't the right thing to do. And so just his teaching alone was enough to prevent them from arresting him. Now the Sadducees then accused the guards of being one of them. All right? And I don't know that that would be a bad thing. If somebody accuses me of being a Christian, I'm okay with that.
Amen.
And I hope that I get that a lot. I hope that my actions and my life would say, he's a Christian. And I'm okay with that, whether they're trying to make that sound like a bad thing or if that's a good thing. And they also accosted Nicodemus. Nicodemus was one of the Sadducees. And he's the one, if you go back to John 3, right before John 3:16, if you go back and read from the beginning of John 3, you'll see that Nicodemus visited Jesus. And he wanted to know more about him. And they accused him then of being a traitor simply because he stood up at this time and he stated the fact that they weren't following their own laws and their own rules. So then they accused him of being a follower of Jesus. Now we know too, we'll find out later at Jesus' crucifixion, that Nicodemus was actually there. And we can only imagine that he actually fully became a supporter of Jesus after his death and resurrection. So we have this is all happening at the end of the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles. It was an annual feast that they had every year. As a follow-up, it was reminding the Jews that when the Israelites came out of Egypt and had to live in these tents in the wilderness, and how God provided everything for them. So this was a celebration of that. So we're in the last day, we're in the 8th day, and this week we're going to be looking at the woman caught in adultery. Okay? Now, before we even read this passage, we notice that the NIV and most Bibles have set this off in brackets. They put brackets around it, and there's a note in the NIV that says that the earliest and most reliable manuscripts and other ancient witnesses do not have John 7:53 through 8:11. And that's true. Most of these old manuscripts don't. In fact, it's not found in any manuscript before the 6th century. And in addition, there are a number of other reasons to suspect that it's not written by John, but by some other well-meaning scribe. One, even when it is included, there are substantial textual variants as well as differences as to where it is placed. Okay? Some manuscripts put it after John 7:36. Some at the end of John, and others put it after Luke 21:38. So several included here, but mark it with an obelisk, indicating that there is something fishy about the whole thing. All right? Now, Tinney, the author, says that no early commentator contains it, nor is it quoted in any other church fathers before Irenaeus, but the multiplicity of the small variants within this pericope indicate that it may have had a checkered literary history. So not everybody thinks that this was from John. Okay? Now, secondly, its inclusion breaks the natural flow between 752 and 812. The scriptures 752 and 812. 753 makes an abrupt switch from the private meeting of the Sanhedrin to this public dispersion of the crowd. So there's a break right here where they put it in the scriptures in John. And thirdly, if it is authentic, it is the only place that John mentions scribes and the only place in the Gospels where Jesus writes anything. Never knew that before, but the Gospels never record Jesus ever writing anything except for here. And then fourthly, there are a couple things in the narrative which are difficult to explain. One of them is, why is Jesus given the authority of a judge? All right? They bring this case to him as if he's a judge. And why did they bring the woman to Jesus and not the man that she slept with? We're going to see that they only bring one part of this adulterous party. Okay? Now all of this suggests that John 7:53 through 8:11 was most probably not a part of John's original text. Now, To say that this text is unauthentic is not to say that it is unhistoric. Just because it's not authentic doesn't mean it's not historic. In other words, it probably was not part of John's original gospel, but it was probably based on an oral tradition from the life of Jesus. Now, Papias, John's disciple, was apparently familiar with the story. And Eusebius explains that Papias has expounded another story about a woman who is accused before the Lord of many sins, which the gospel, according to the Hebrews, contains this. Okay? Now, Augustine, he stated that this story was removed from some of the manuscripts lest it be appealed to by would-be adulteresses. They took this out so they couldn't give these women who were committing adultery the reason to say, well, look, Jesus forgave her and she wasn't punished, therefore you have to forgive me and not punish me. All right? So he was saying that some people pulled this out so that adulterous women couldn't use it in their defense. Now, this would be understandable well amidst the rise of asceticism, but therefore we will treat this text as a useful vignette from Jesus' life. But we hold it lightly since the inclusion in John's Gospel is very dubious. All that being said, I like this story. I don't care if John wrote it or not. This is Jesus perfectly demonstrated. So let's get into this text, all right? John 7:53 through chapter 8, verse 5. It says, they went each to his own house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. And early in the morning he came again to the temple, and all the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. And the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. So what do you say? Now everyone after the festival went home for the night after a day of these heated debates that happened before. There was a lot of debates that happened the night before. And since the feast is now over, they dismantle their tents, which they had erected, and they go back to their beds in their homes. But Jesus is still camping out in one of his favorite haunts. Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives. We find out he goes there a lot. He likes that place. So the following morning, just after sunrise, Jesus is again in the midst of the temple with an eager audience all around him waiting for him to teach. And this would be the 8th day of the feast, the solemn assembly. Now we found out last week that after the whole festival and everything's done, everybody's done partying, they shut down the party, and then they go to the temple for class. They go there and they listen to the scribes and the Pharisees, and they teach them. Okay? So the educated religious right, the Pharisees and the scribes, that is, they present Jesus with this dilemma. Here's a woman caught in the act of adultery, and she stands in the midst of a murderous mob with her heart pounding and her palms sweating. All right? She's guilty. She knows it. She's not denying it. She just doesn't know what's going to happen to her. She wonders if she'll even survive the incident, and this will happen so suddenly that the sinner's sheets have not even cooled off yet. All right? They've got her there so quick, it's making her head spin. Now, perhaps this joyous celebration and this the delicious wine that they had during the feast for the last 7 days seduced her into this sin. And she let her guard down. Maybe she was feeling good, and she just fell into this sinful act. Now, here she is in the temple of God, exposed. Quick change from having the party to being exposed right in the middle of the temple. The very stones of this holy place seem to condemn her of the sin in the midst of all this. So the crowd, while peeved at the interruption, are yet sadistically curious of the spectacle, and they speak volumes with their eyes. Okay? They know, they're all staring at her, they're all gawking at her, they're all looking at her like she's a sinner. As they drag her into the temple, she is publicly disgraced and standing alone with not so much the support of her lover. They drag her in by herself. They leave him beside. And by the way, where is this guy? Okay? If they were caught in the act, why is he not there to receive the judgment of stoning? Go back to Leviticus 20:10. It says both of them get stoned. Not just the woman. They both get stoned. But where is he? Now, you can tell that the scribes, their hypocrisy is very blatant here. Not only is the man's absence a glaring inconsistency with all this, so is the Pharisaic presence for where this took place. How could this woman be caught in the act without a malicious trap? How did they know she was committing adultery with a man if they weren't standing there? A bunch of perverts standing there watching. Sorry. They set her up and they knew it was happening. Okay? So they care neither for the sin nor the woman. They don't care about her sin. They don't care about her. She is merely a tool to get at Jesus. They're using this woman as a tool. This is how low these religious leaders of this time are stooping to get to Jesus. They're sacrificing this woman for that. So here's Jesus presented with the dilemma. And they ask him very emphatically, "What do you say?" They want to know what Jesus has to say. And if he condemns the woman, he may risk the wrath of Rome for pronouncing capital punishment. He can't do that. He can't order anybody to be stoned. That's Rome's decision to do that. And he may also lose face with the crowds who have followed him partially because of his compassion. Jesus is a compassionate guy and people are following him. So if he condemns this woman and has her stoned, now they're going to say, where's the compassion that this guy had? Now all of a sudden he's stoning women, right? But on the other hand, if he excuses this woman, he could rightly be accused of contradicting the law of Moses, which demands the stoning of an adulteress. Go back to Deuteronomy 22 through 24. But Jesus will not be trapped in a catch-22. He's too wise for that, nor will he allow such flagrant hypocrisy to go undetected. He puts these guys in their place pretty quick. Watch this. John chapter 8, verses 6 through 11. And this they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. And Jesus bent down and wrote with his fingers on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" And she said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on sin no more." So, Jesus, as if very disinterested in the whole question, he stoops down and starts to write on the ground. Now this is very strange. It's very uncharacteristic of Jesus. Now there are very many speculations of what he wrote. I've heard a lot of things about what he wrote on the ground. All right? One attractive suggestion is that he wrote accusations against the various Sanhedrin members standing there. He'd write their name and then what they had done wrong. Maybe he was listing out their sins. I don't want him to write mine. It's going to take a whole novel. So another one says that he wrote a list of their names, and still another one supposes that he just doodled to show a disinterest. I don't care. But we're curious about what he wrote, but apparently it doesn't matter what he wrote. Okay? The emphasis on the act of writing, not what was written. So while Jesus scribbles in the sand, they keep pressing him for an answer, and they get more of an answer than they bargained for. All right? He lays it out here. Now, Jesus is kneeling. He stands up, adding force to his response. All right? So he stood up, and now he's got their attention. And without disregarding either the law of Moses or this precious person, this woman, he simply says, "If any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Now, Jesus is not saying that her accusers have to be sinless. Okay? They don't have to be sinless. That would spell the demise of all legal proceedings. If we based everything based on whether somebody's sin is greater than the other, we'd never get anything done. We're all sinners and fall short of the glory of God, right?
Amen.
But he's not saying that they have to be sinless. He is merely suggesting that they be adequate witnesses. All right? That they need to be adequate witnesses. According to Deuteronomy 19:16 through 19, this means that they must not be malicious or deceitful. Their motive must not be malicious or deceitful. Same with us. When we're judging the actions of somebody else, we should not do it with maliciousness or deceitfulness in our heart. It should be out of the motive of bringing the person along and mentoring them, all right? Discipling them. It's not about maliciousness or deceitfulness. Sometimes we do that, and we shouldn't. But that's what he's saying. They have to do this. But Jesus exposes their devious sting operation here. Okay, they're trying to nail Jesus and not this woman. Again, it's not about the woman. Now they, along with this woman, have been caught in the act. They've both been caught doing something wrong. Furthermore, those who would throw the first stone, according to the Jewish prudence, must be witnesses of the crime. They had to witness the crime. In order to bring her up there, they had to be witnesses. So, again, they've set her up. These guys are at the center of a vicious trap. Okay? So Jesus, with one sentence, identifies, criticizes, and dismantles this whole dirty business. He nails it with one. I want Jesus as my lawyer if I ever get in trouble. One sentence, and he wipes them all out. So then he stoops back down and continues to doodle in the dust. Right? So the older ones leave first. Their wisdom and moderation having been forged by time, they leave first, and the others follow reluctantly. And by, the whole inner band of accusers disperses, leaving this woman alone with Jesus in the center. Now, the NIV reads, it says that left her in the center. Now, this Greek word for center means the center of what? It doesn't say where they were at. Well, she was in the center of the original crowd of disciples whose class was broken up by this charade. He was teaching, remember? He came into the temple, he sat down, and he was teaching, and then here they break in with this mob, this angry mob, to crucify this woman or stone her, and there's a class sitting there. And so whenever all those people leave, she's still sitting in the middle of all these people. Now it says alone with Jesus, but those people were still there. So she was in the center of this group. All right? Now all the woman's accusers are gone, but Jesus alone is left there, but a single witness isn't sufficient for capital punishment. He can't condemn her by himself. Nor does Jesus desire to condemn her. He didn't come to condemn the world, he came to save it. He didn't come to condemn her, he came to save her. And he treats her with gentleness and respect. And she is forgiven. She is free. She is forgiven. She is free. That's what we get with Christianity. We are forgiven, and we are free as well. All right? Now, Christ's forgiveness is freely given, but it's not cheap. Okay? Hear me when I say this. With grace comes the expectation of godliness. With grace comes the expectation of godliness. When we receive God's grace, He expects us to become more godly. He expects us to follow Him, not return to where we were before. Jesus sends her away with a commission to purity. Now, if this story is not true, it is at least truly reflects the character and the beauty of our Lord's love for broken people. So many times we see people that want the fire insurance that comes with being a Christian. I'm not going to hell, I'm going to heaven. And they accept Jesus, and then they turn right back around, and they walk back to their vomit, and they walk right back to their sin, and they walk right back into it. And that's not what that's what God expects of us. He gave us His Son on a cross, not so that we can just be forgiven and then go to heaven, but so that we can live a godly life and have a relationship with Him. Yes. And we miss that so often.
Amen.
You know, and I'm not here to judge, and it's not for me to judge, but what the good book tells me, and from what I understand, is those people are taking a huge risk.
Yes.
All right? We have to live our lives to be more godly, to be more Christ-like. And He tells her to go and sin no more. Get out of that lifestyle. Quit. If that's your first and only adulterous affair, then don't have any more. But if it's one of many, then quit doing it. That's what He's just telling her. Go. Okay, I don't condemn you. He doesn't condemn us. There's going to be a day. There's going to come a day when that happens, but it's not today. So now, we go right back, John drops right back in, and we see where Jesus is saying that He is the light of the world. In John chapter 8, Jesus moves about the temple, and He's preaching in the temple. And His message or messages expands the discussion that comes out of chapter 7. He's still expanding on this. And we find Him first in the court of women, where 13 trumpet-shaped vessels line one wall. There was an area in the temple that was called the court of women, and that's where He's at. On the other side of the wall was the meeting room of the Sanhedrin. So this is where the Sanhedrin met, and this court was reserved for the Pharisees. Not Jesus, He shouldn't have been in there teaching. This was reserved for the Pharisees. So he walks in and just takes over their spot and in their face. And he says, what are you going to do about it? And he's in there teaching with more authority than they ever could. So he walks in there, and here is where they taught their disciples. The Pharisees taught their disciples. Well, Jesus is going to do some real teaching of his disciples. And yet no one stopped him, even though he was within earshot of the Sanhedrin. Nobody dared to come out and challenge him. They've done this too many times, and they've lost too many times. Oh, they wanted to, but Jesus' time had not yet come. We keep hearing this. Nothing's going to happen to him until God says, now's the time. So from here, Jesus moves out to the porches of the temple. And outside the sanctuary, the crowds would be free to ask questions and to enter in with conversation. Okay, you can't do that in a temple. You got to wait till you get outside. You got to obey the rules. And once they get outside the courts, now they can start talking to Jesus and asking him questions. Unfortunately, they didn't much like what he had to say out there. So in fact, they picked up stones from the construction site to kill him. They were still working on the temple. They're picking up stones that are actually building the temple to go try to kill Jesus. Let's look at this. John chapter 8, 12 through 20. Again, Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So the Pharisees said to him, you are bearing witness about yourself. Your testimony is not true. And Jesus answered, even if I do bear witness about myself, my testimony is true, for I know where I come from and where I'm going. But you do not know where I come from or where I'm going. You judge according to the flesh. I judge no one. Yet even if I do judge, my judgment is true, for it is not I alone who judge, but I and the Father who sent me. Now in your law it's written that the testimony of two people is true. I am the one who bears witness about myself, and the Father who sent me bears witness about me. And they said to him, therefore, where is your Father? And Jesus answered, you know neither me nor my Father. If you knew me, you would know my Father also. And these words he spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple, but no one arrested him because his hour had not yet come. Okay, so this is the second of the Jesus I am statements. Okay, there was one in 6:35, here in 8:12. There's going to be another one in 10:7, 10:9, 11:14, 11:25, 14:26, 15:1, and 5. Okay, so Jesus, several times in the gospel, says, I am. This is the second time he says it. So, and perhaps this is the richest time he uses it. So light is used to represent truth because it exposes what is actually there, and purity because of its own essence. Light is very specific to these people. In the New Testament, these two qualities of light are personified in 4 different ways. Light is personified in God. Okay? It's also personified in Jesus, who is God's envoy. It's personified in Christians as envoys of Jesus, and it's personified in the gospel as proclaimed by Christians. You see how that works? God, Jesus, us, and then the word that we proclaim. This is all the light. And there is a ton of scripture here that supports all this. I'm not gonna read all this off. There's no way you can write it all down by the time I'm done. But there's a ton of scripture in here that supports all this light talk. So there is a fierce conflict between light and darkness. We know that. Between good and evil, heaven and hell, there's a fierce conflict. Darkness hates the light, but because it exposes and thereby judges the evil deeds. Okay? Darkness hates the light. Sin hates Jesus. Now, this competition between darkness and light, which is God and Satan, will end with the consummation of the kingdom. It'll come to an end. Read Revelation. It's going to come to a head at some point. There's going to be a second coming where this kingdom now comes to its fulfillment. And finally, all this light theology is embodied in the New Jerusalem, which will have its light, the Lord Jesus Christ. Go to Revelation 21 and 22 and read about it. Jesus will light the New Jerusalem, the new kingdom. He will be the light of the world. And he's saying, I am the light right now in their presence, and they're just not getting it. Now, the light of the menorah, which is this big candlestick, played a prominent role in the Feast of Tabernacles, which they just celebrated. Its light spreads across the court of women where Jesus is presently teaching. That's the only light in there. And perhaps this illusion connects directly with God's light of the tabernacle. But nonetheless, when Jesus applies to himself the metaphor of life, the Pharisees can hardly miss its messianic implication. When he says that, the Pharisees get it. And he's speaking so that they can hear. He's teaching, but he's actually throwing darts at these guys. And he knows it, and they know it. They challenge him on such an audacious claim. They immediately jump all over it. They know it. And again, they call him a misguided maverick, speaking on his own behalf. Now, you go into a court of law and you try to defend yourself, you're not going to get a whole lot of support. And that's what these guys are saying. Jesus, you've got no other support. Well, he's already done this 2 other times in the Gospels. He's already said, God testifies for me, John testifies for me, and the Word testifies about me. I don't need anything else. And I testify about myself. I don't need any more. But, again, according to the Mosaic law of testimony, any statement required at least 2 or 3 witnesses. And they're going to use this to their advantage. Twice already Jesus has delineated his supporting witnesses, and he hardly needs to do that again here. He's not going to repeat himself again and again and again. He said, I've already told you. And here's where it's here, and it's the same as it was then and it is now. So it may sound like Jesus is contradicting himself in verse 14. But since the Pharisees have rejected or ignored all of Jesus' supporting witnesses, what can he do but simply verify his own testimony? Truly, he is the only one who can testify about his heavenly origin, his unity with the Father, and the consistency between what he says and what God says. No one else has been to heaven and back who can verify the truth of what Jesus says. Okay? Nobody else has been to heaven except Jesus. He came from there. He's the only one that can testify about his life in heaven. John and Moses received divine revelation about Jesus, but the Pharisees have rejected their testimony. They hang everything on Moses and his law, but then when Jesus uses Moses, they reject it because Jesus said it. These guys are crazy. They won't believe anything. All right? So, the Pharisees have demonstrated a resolute refusal just to listen to Jesus. And since they know not the Father, they have no way to receive his testimony. They don't really know God. They're in it for the money and the power. All right? They don't have any reason. They have no intentions of making God priority. It's all about their position and their power. Sadly, Jesus is their only way to the Father, but they have cut him off already. Jesus is the only way to heaven.
Amen.
No other way. And these guys have shut him off already. Okay? They've now burned every bridge out of the valley of the shadow of death. They're not getting there if they don't change from their wicked ways. So all that is left is judgment and certain death. Now, as I said, Jesus came not to judge the world, but to save it. John 3:16 and 17. Read those. Don't just stop at 16. Read 17. Because Jesus did not come to condemn the world, but to save it. However, in the process of preaching the gospel of salvation, his words set some parameters about who would and who would not be saved. Okay? Read John 5:24. He sets the parameters of who's going to be saved and who's not. Now, in this slice of time we call the incarnate, it is not the Son of Man who judges, but it's his words that most certainly do. Jesus is not judging anybody. Okay? It's the Word of God that's judging people. The future non-incarnate Christ, okay, the future Jesus that we'll meet, will indeed pass judgment on this world, and all evil men who refuse to accept God's messenger will be judged. So here he's telling them, I'm the light. You either accept me, or you're going to spend an eternity in hell. Jesus' words, not mine. Still relevant today. You either accept Christ, or you spend an eternity in hell. Simple. But we tend not to want to believe that. We tend to want to excuse that, because we don't like that. I didn't like it whenever I was a non-Christian. And I chose to disregard it. Then I went to the point where I said, well, there is no heaven or hell, so I don't care if I do die, I'm not going to hell anyway. Well, it's a good thing I lived past that point, because had I died at that time, I'd be spending eternity in hell. It's just the plain truth. All right? Maybe you don't believe it. Maybe you don't like what the Bible says. Maybe you don't want to believe it. Take your chances. All right? But all the Christians that follow this, I don't see anything bad that comes of this.